or 14, or 16.
Okay, so here's where I asked it. Okay, so 14 or 16, many more than 2, right? Okay. So,
Always even.
What's that?
Always even.
Always even. Thank you. Shouldn't have used corn in this audience. Okay. So also the seed structure is quite different. Teosinte is encased in this hard fruit case, whereas in our corn that has been largely reduced and it has become part of the cob. Yes? Okay. And also the seed coloration is different. So here we can see a circle teosinte here, and it blends in really well with the soil, so it's very difficult to detect. If you were a bird flying around, you would obviously go for one of these guys, which is a maize, which is a maize seed. Okay, so but the domestication of crops in the Neolithic Revolution didn't just involve maize and potato and wheat and barley and rice. So nearly all of the grains and the produce that we can find at our local grocery store underwent these major evolutionary changes. So for those of you who bake, you can make apple pie that originated from Kazakhstan, or Simmer's tomato sauce from tomatoes that were domesticated in South America, or if you're like me, you drink lots of coffee that is believed to have originated from Ethiopia. So the domestication of crops from their wild relatives changed the genetics of these species, and ultimately this gave rise to an interdependence. So we depend on these species for our survival just as much as they depend on us for theirs. So grain production, so this is jumping like 10,000 years now. Only have 15 minutes. So grain production by the 1960s, we were able to produce about 1 billion tons of grain annually. Okay, so that took 10,000 years. Getting to 2 billion tons of grain annually only took the next 40. So this major step change in agricultural productivity is known as the Green Revolution, and this was the systematic deployment of improved varieties along with, so in conjunction with, improved agronomic practices. And this happened in the 1960s and 70s, and this led to the doubling of wheat and rice yields, largely in Latin America and tropical Asia. So if we look here at rice yields, which are shown in blue, you can see this is from 1961 to 2001. We can see that they've increased steadily over time, and then concurrently, so these are in purple rice prices, they have concurrently dropped. So this rise in rice yields and rice production led to, or encouraged the adoption of mechanization practices such as tractors. So adoption of these new varieties was really rapid, and this is partly due, or I would say primarily due to the fact that wheat and rice species are naturally inbreeding. So what this means, this is implications for seed exchange. What this means is that farmers are able to save seed and plant it the next year, and it also means that they're able to share seed that they like. So here is an Indian farmer pictured in 1967. His name is Nikanti Subbarao, and he is known as Mr. IR8. So does anyone know what IR8 is? Okay, yes.
You want me to answer? It's a rice variety, it's very popular.
Yes, it's a rice variety, but what makes it special is that it was the first released high-yielding rice variety that came out of the Green Revolution. So semi-dwarf high-yielding rice variety. You can see it here. And this guy was nicknamed Mr. IR8 because he was the first one in India, the first farmer in India to have these large-scale on-farm demonstrations. This was government-sponsored, and then all the farmers from his village as well as neighboring villages could come and see the performance of IR8 for themselves and make a decision. Do I want to plant this versus traditional varieties? And when they saw the yield benefits, they all did. And so it was through this type of farmer-to-farmer knowledge transfer that really catalyzed the Green Revolution in India. Okay, so the new high-yielding varieties looked quite different from the traditional ones. They were semi-dwarf, so that meant they were a lot shorter in stature. This is a traditional variety. It's quite tall and lanky. And at the time, so this was not really an accident. This was a systematic deployment of technology, the Green Revolution. So So at the time, breeders at the International Rice Research Institute, located in the Philippines, where I've spent a bit of time, they knew of semi-dwarf varieties that the farmers in Taiwan planted. And they were special because they were short, but they withstood large amounts of fertilizer. Whereas in the tropics, we have these tall, lanky varieties. When you gave it fertilizer, they basically produced profuse amounts of leaves and fell over because they were too top heavy. And so what they did was they bred into tropical rice using a donor from Taiwan, a short dwarf donor called DG Wujin. And they selected for short, high-yielding, but tropically adapted rice. And we know now, so this is due to a gene called SE1, semi-dwarf 1, we know now, after doing all the genetics on it, that SE1 actually affects a lot more than just plant height. It completely changes the way the plant allocates resources. So if we look here at the response of two varieties, this is, in the black is Pita. This is a traditional tall, lanky variety. And this in green is IR8, our special high-yielding rice. And this is their response to nitrogen. So as you increase nitrogen, so under low nitrogen, they yield the same. As you apply more nitrogen, IR8 responds by producing more yield, and Pita actually yields less than under no nitrogen, or under zero nitrogen. And the interesting part is that Pita is one of the parents of IR8, so they are related. And this is what it looks like. This is under high nitrogen. Pita basically gets super big and falls over, and this is IR8. You can see, if you squint, it's beginning to head and produce grain. So I call this a match made between G and E, so where G is the genotype and E is the environment. So it's not one or the other that led to these large increases in yield and productivity. Okay, so the Green Revolution was really effective at increasing yields under favorable conditions. So these are irrigated lowland conditions. But rice also, one of the constraints to rice, especially in flood-prone regions, is too much or too little water, which is interesting. So here is a map of India, and in pink, these are the flood-prone states. So they get monsoon seasons, and you can experience two types of floods. There are these flash floods that come, where water levels rise really rapidly and then recede after 1 or 2 weeks. And then there's something called stagnant flooding or periodic flooding, where you have months-long flooding. Here's in blue, so this is where rice production is predominant in India. This is a picture of a farmer retransplanting his fields after flash floods. And so Erie breeders, the International Rice Research Institute, they also set out to try and improve rice for these rain-fed regions, these flood-prone regions. And so really early on, back in the 70s and 80s, they had identified several flash flood tolerant varieties. So they call them submergence tolerance varieties from India, these flood-prone states. And what these varieties did was that they basically, when a flash flood comes, they're underwater. Most rice varieties will try to metabolize and grow, and eventually they'll drown. These rice varieties basically hold their breath, so they don't do anything and they wait. Somehow they know, they're adapted. And then after floodwaters recede, they start and they begin to metabolize again, and then they can grow from there. So one such variety is called FR13A. And in the 80s and 90s, breeders started making crosses. So like, oh, okay, we've got tolerant varieties, we'll just make semi-dwarf tolerant varieties using these as donors. And what happened was these were never adopted because grain quality was really bad and they were still low yielding. They were semi-dwarf and they were submergence tolerant, but you still have to, farmers still need good quality for their markets, they still need high yields. So apparently these traits had also been introduced from these donors, these tolerant donors. And so in the mid-90s, so that sort of stopped for a little while, and then in the mid-1990s, geneticists they tried to define the region of the genome that was associated with this trait, and they found a locus on chromosome 9, and they called it the sub-1 region, and it conferred submergence tolerance. And so they started this program in 2003 called marker selection. So they took FR13A, which again is the tolerant line, and they made a cross with Swarna. Swarna is a really popular farmer preferred variety in India. And this time was different because they knew where sub 1 was, on chromosome 9, the short arm. And so they did what they normally do. They made a cross and then they evaluated progeny. But this time, instead of growing out all the progeny and then imposing flooding and then waiting to see what died and what survived, they looked at their genetics. So what you see here in blue, so blue is the Swarna genome and red is this tolerant FR13A genome. And so what they did was they screened the genetic markers and they looked to see, oh, okay, which rice line has the FR13A sub 1 region. And so I marked these here with arrows. So they know, like, okay, so we've got FR13A in that genome region. I know it's going to be tolerant. But just as importantly, they also looked to see which ones had the most Swarna, or the most blue genome, because that meant it was more likely to have the farmer-preferred traits of high yield and high quality. And this is what's called marker-assisted selection. And by around 2008, 2009, they were able to get a rice line out that was almost 100% genetically identical to Swarna, with just this little piece on chromosome 9 from FR13A that conferred blood tolerance. And when we look at what happens with yield, so on the x-axis we have shorter submergence and then longer submergence, and then this is yield on the y-axis. So we see that under no submergence, there's actually no yield cost between Swarna and Swarna sub 1. And as we increase the length of submergence, we start to see a yield benefit from Swarna sub 1, whereas Swarna, the yields still are not high, but it's not nothing, right? It's quite a bit higher than nothing. But more importantly, in a farmer's field, it looks like this. So these are flood-affected rice fields. They were submerged for 10 days straight, and this picture was taken 27 days after the floodwaters receded. So remember, these are almost genetically identical. This is Swarna, which is trying to recover but not doing so well, and this is Swarna sub 1, and this is Uttar Pradesh in India. So by 2012, 4 million farmers across India, Bangladesh, and Nepal had adopted these newer varieties. And again, it was through farmer-to-farmer knowledge transfer that these seeds were passed on. And here's our old friend, Nikanti Subbarao, and he was actually one of the first pioneering farmers to trial Swarna sub 1 as well. So these types of technologies are actually developing within a lifetime. They're quite fast. So we saw that having the tool of molecular markers enabled selection that wasn't possible prior, but functionally breeders were still making crosses and still making selection, just as they had in the Green Revolution and prior. So in the past 20 minutes or so, 15 minutes maybe, so we've gone through from the Neolithic Revolution out to 2 green revolutions in rice, currently right over there. And in India, this is rice yields in India over time from 1970 to 2015. We see that yields have been increasing, but the green line shows the area under rice production. We see that the area has not changed too much. So breeders and agronomists are doing pretty well. So why fix something if it isn't broken, right? Okay, I guess I'll tell you why. I was going to ask a question, but you guys seem quiet right now. So climate, unfortunately, our planet is undergoing climate change, and these dates are, I pulled from a paper from Nature from about 6 years ago, and these dates, these numbers indicate the dates at which the climate in that city is expected to depart from the normal that was present from about 1960 to 2000.
So you said you were going to ask us questions, but we're quiet, so I think you need to show how you can stimulate boring class. But could you go back? Well, I'm going to ask a question.
Sure.
Can you go back one question, and then maybe it will. So I'm an undergrad at Purdue, and I grew up on a farm growing corn and soybeans.
Yeah.
Why are you teaching me about rice? I don't care about rice. I don't grow it in Indiana.
Well, hopefully one of the outcomes of this class is to try and bring other viewpoints in, I guess, as well as across disciplines. So trying to bring context, other context besides corn and soy in Indiana. So working across, so for an agronomist, working with engineers and computer scientists, and for people who grew up in Indiana to try to think about the foods that other cultures eat and very much depend on. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty good.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about why.
There's
Okay,
one
so-
in every class.
So climate change is one reason. What's another reason that we need to start thinking about different ways, or why we're all in this class about digital agriculture if what we're doing is pretty good? Like, why are you taking this class?
Population growth.
Yes, very good. Well, that's two more, so you jumped ahead. How do I lead
It's always
ahead?
horrible when the answers don't
Teachers'
order.
pet.
Man. So an FAO report last fall also warns that climate change is a driver of global hunger, and of course world population is still increasing. We're expected to level out by the turn of the century, by the end of the century. However, that still means we've got about 3 billion more mouths to feed. And also, by the end of the century, about 80% of the world population will be living in Africa and Asia. And so these are